In the fall of 1852, the town of Ashcroft, Massachusetts whispered a secret it dared not write down. It was said that a wedding had taken place on the edge of the river orchard, a wedding sealed not with joy but with dread. The bride was radiant, her veil trembling in the wind, yet the town swore her face looked far too much like the man who kissed her. Some whispered they were siblings. Others swore they were not even alive at all. The preacher who officiated vanished within the week, leaving his Bible open to an unholy passage about blood and covenant. And those who witnessed the vows, those who lingered long enough to hear the silence after the I do, would not sleep soundly again. This is the story they buried. This is the story of the forbidden wedding. Ashes in the orchard, the autumn of 1852 bled slow and heavy into the valley of Ashcroft, Massachusetts, a town already brittle with suspicion and silence. The maples along the orchard ridges burned themselves out in shades of rust and scarlet, their leaves falling not like blessings but like warnings, each one a silent scrap of evidence that something beautiful had died. Before its time, Ashcroft was the sort of place where men still believed the soil remembered sin, where a crooked fence post could be blamed on the curse of a long-forgotten transgression. It was a settlement inherited from the Puritans, haunted not by ghosts in the usual sense, but by rules too rigid to rot. To be born there was to inherit its secrets. To marry there was to risk binding yourself not only to a partner, but to the collective memory of a place that did not forget. And in 1852, that memory was about to be stained with a story so unspeakable that even the church bell seemed reluctant to ring. The house of the Mortons sat at the edge of Ashcroft's western orchard, where the trees bent inward as though shielding it from view. It was not a ruin yet. Its beams still stood. Its shutters clung to hinges, but there was something about it that looked unfinished, or perhaps overfinished, as though the house itself had grown weary of its own presence. Travelers who passed along the dirt road swore that no smoke ever rose from its chimney, though on certain evenings when the sky folded in on itself and the orchard turned black, a faint orange flicker pressed against the upper windows like the last gasps of a lantern. Inside lived two siblings. Nathaniel Morton, 28, carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew the town but did not care to belong to it. He was tall, with dark hair he wore longer than fashion permitted, and hands that looked more accustomed to grasping pen and paper than axe or plow. Though he claimed the family estate as his inheritance, he was rarely seen in the fields. Some whispered he wrote letters to figures outside Ashcroft, others that he practiced a form of science that tested God's patience. What was certain is that Nathaniel spoke in a manner both charming and unsettling, his words deliberate, his eyes unblinking too long. His sister, Eleanor, was 25. Unlike Nathaniel, she drifted through Ashcroft like a half-forgotten hymn. She attended church irregularly, and when she did, she sat apart from the other women, her veil lowered not out of piety but out of preference. The seamstresses whispered that Eleanor's beauty was of a fragile kind, the sort that made you wonder if her skin was too thin, if the world pressed too hard against her. Her hair, pale as ash, never seemed to catch the sun, and her eyes held a shade of blue that reminded some of river ice, beautiful but untrustworthy. They lived alone after their parents' deaths. At least that was the official story. Ashcroft's gossip was not merely idle, it was a system of defense. A woman who wore the wrong color too soon after her husband's burial might be whispered into exile. A man who lingered too long in the tavern with another man's wife might find his farm mysteriously unfed by rain. And so the Mortons, with their strange detachment, were discussed in hushed tones and careful glances. Why had Nathaniel never taken a wife? Why had Eleanor turned away suitors, even those with promising land and reputation? Why, above all, did the townsfolk often see them walking together at twilight, too close, speaking in voices too low for siblings? Some swore they saw Eleanor's hand tucked in Nathaniel's arm as though she were already his bride. Others said they saw them in the orchard, standing so still beneath the bent branches that they could not tell where the siblings ended and the shadows began. The town did not accuse, not openly. Ashcroft believed in the power of silence in letting suspicion ripen into truth. But by late autumn of 1852, silence was no longer enough. It began with Reverend Hale's disappearance. Hale had been the town's minister for 12 years, a stern but steady figure who knew every family by name. He was last seen entering the Mortons' estate on a rain-thick evening, Bible in hand. Some assumed it was for confession, others for counsel, though what counsel Nathaniel and Eleanor would seek no one could guess. The following Sunday, Hale did not appear in his pulpit. His absence was excused at first, illness perhaps, or a trip to visit kin. But by the second week, when his chambers lay untouched, and his horse remained stabled, Ashcroft's patience began to fray. On the third week, a child wandering near the orchard found Hale's Bible lying open at the base of an apple tree. Its pages stiff with rain and something darker. The passage exposed was from Leviticus, warning against the uncovering of the nakedness of thy sister. The town understood what was being suggested, and yet none dared speak it aloud. Inside the Morton house, Eleanor lit no lamps. She moved through its corridors by memory, her pale hands grazing the wood of the banisters as though reassuring herself the house still stood. Nathaniel was often at his writing desk, scratching long letters into the night. Eleanor once asked to whom he wrote, but his reply, "To the only one who understands Onadori," was too thin to settle her curiosity. But she did not press. There was a pact between them, one older than words. It was not simply that they were siblings, not simply that grief had bound them after their parents' deaths. It was something unspoken, something neither dared define for fear of naming it into existence, and yet, as autumn deepened, Eleanor began to feel the town's eyes burning against her veil, its whispers tightening like a noose. She felt it most acutely in church when she walked past Hale's empty pulpit, past the congregation's stairs. The air seemed to weigh differently then, pressing her inward, urging her back to the orchard where no eyes followed. Back to Nathaniel. The orchard itself was no ordinary land. The trees bent in strange shapes as though each had grown in reaction to some pressure not visible to the eye. The soil was dark, richer than it ought to be, and in spring the blossoms arrived too early, clinging with unnatural resilience. The Mortons claimed the orchard as their inheritance, but some whispered it was cursed, that their father had dug more than roots from the earth, and that what was buried there did not always remain buried. Children dared each other to run between the rows at dusk. Those who tried swore the trees whispered, their branches rattling like teeth in a jaw. Some said they saw figures moving between trunks, reflections that matched their own faces but lingered too long. It was in that orchard that Nathaniel often asked Eleanor to walk with him, their footsteps pressing the soil as though writing their secret into the earth. And it was in that orchard that Eleanor began to dream. The first dream came like a fever. She found herself beneath the apple boughs, her dress white though she had never worn white. The air carried the scent of rot and roses, a blend that made her stomach twist. Ahead of her stood Nathaniel waiting, dressed not in his usual black coat but in a suit far finer than his means. "You are late," he told her, though she did not recall being summoned. She looked down and saw her hands clasped in gloves of lace, and a ring, gold thin, biting into her finger. She pulled at it, but it did not move. The orchard swayed like a congregation, branches bowing as though awaiting vows. Then she heard it, the sound of pages turning, a voice reading words she could not yet place. She turned and saw Reverend Hale, but his mouth was sewn shut, his words emerging not from lips but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that made her ears ring. When she looked back, Nathaniel was closer. His hand brushed her veil, and Eleanor woke with the taste of soil in her mouth. That morning she found Nathaniel already awake, staring at her from the threshold of her room. "You cried out," he said simply. Eleanor clutched her blanket. "Did I?" He nodded. "You said yes." Her heart struck her ribs. "Yes?" "Yes." His smile was faint, unreadable, as though answering a question. Eleanor wanted to protest, to insist she did not know what he meant. But his eyes lingered too long, as though daring her to recall. And beneath his stare she felt again the weight of the veil, the ring that would not move. Days passed. Hale did not return. The orchard grew bare, its branches skeletal against the sky. But the dreams persisted. Each one drew her deeper into the imagined or perhaps inevitable ceremony. The gown grew heavier, the ring tighter, Nathaniel's presence closer. Hale's sewn mouth whispered scripture she was certain did not exist. And each time she woke, Nathaniel seemed to know. He was waiting in the hall, waiting at the foot of her bed. Waiting by the window, his reflection overlapping hers in the glass. "You know what is required," he whispered once. his voice low enough to be mistaken for thought. Eleanor did not answer, but her silence was beginning to sound like consent. One night, unable to bear it, she left her room and wandered to Nathaniel's study. The door was ajar. Inside, she saw letters scattered across his desk, their ink still wet. She picked one up before she could stop herself. The words were not addressed to anyone familiar. They were to her. Eleanor, you must understand. The world cannot keep us apart. The orchard knows. The house knows. Even God must know. What is forbidden by men is sanctified by blood. Soon all will see, and the vows will be ours. I write to you because I fear you will not hear me waking. The letter trembled in her hand. She looked to the desk. There were dozens more, each one bearing her name. Letters never given, only written. Her stomach lurched. She placed the letter back, and then she noticed the object resting atop the stack. A small silver band. A wedding ring. Eleanor fled the study, but the house did not let her go easily. The hallways seemed longer, the stairs deeper, the shadows thicker. When at last she reached her room, she barred the door and pressed her forehead against the wood, her breath ragged. But from the other side, a knock came. Eleanor. Nathaniel's voice murmured. You read them, didn't you? She bit her lip to keep from answering. Do not fear, he said, his hand pressed against the door, his shadow long in the lamplight. The vows are not yet taken, but soon. Very soon. And then, after a pause that felt like hours, the reverend has agreed already. The reverend's silence. The Sunday after the discovery of Reverend Hale's abandoned Bible, Ashcroft gathered in the chapel as though summoned to a trial. The pulpit stood empty, its wood pale in the morning light. No hymns were sung. No scripture was read. Instead, the congregation stared at the vacant place where Hale had once thundered against temptation, where he had warned them that sin always left a shadow. Now there was only silence. It was an unnatural silence, one that made even the rafters creak uneasily. Mothers clutched their children close. Men shifted in their pews as though sitting on coals. At last, Deacon Merriweather stood, his beard trembling with age and authority. The reverend is delayed, he said, though his voice cracked on the word. But the work of the Lord is not delayed. We will hold fast. We will endure. His eyes lingered too long on Eleanor Morton. From that day forward, whispers in Ashcroft grew teeth. Children were kept indoors after dusk. Neighbors turned their lanterns away from the orchard road. A group of men even suggested searching the Morton estate, but none volunteered to lead. It was said that the orchard's branches leaned lower when you entered, as though ready to close behind you, and yet Hale's absence demanded explanation. When his chambers were searched, his possessions were untouched. His coat still hung by the door. His spectacles lay on his desk, beside a sermon draft that ended abruptly mid-sentence. The greatest trespass is not of flesh, but of covenant. Beside the draft was a scrap of paper folded once, bearing a single word in Hale's hand. Yes. No one knew to whom it was addressed. Eleanor heard the town's whispers long before they reached her directly. Women fell silent when she entered the mercantile. Men lowered their eyes but did not lift their hats. Once, when she reached for a spool of thread, another woman snatched her hand back as though Eleanor's touch might burn. At night, she prayed for silence in her dreams. Yet the orchard returned again and again. Each night it grew more vivid, the vows clearer, Nathaniel's voice nearer. But worse than the dreams were the moments she could not tell if she was dreaming at all. Once, she woke to find her dress laid across the chair by her bed. Not the dark, modest dress she had worn the day before, but the gown from her dreams. White, threaded with lace. The hem damp with soil. She gasped, clutching it to banish the image, but when she blinked, the chair was bare again. Had it been there, or had she only imagined it? Nathaniel knocked moments later, his voice low. Eleanor, did you see it too? Meanwhile, the men of Ashcroft began to argue in taverns, their voices tight with both drink and fear. It is the Mortons, one declared. That family has been wrong since their father planted the orchard. You know he dug more than roots out there. Quiet, another hissed, glancing around. Speak less, listen more. The Mortons hear what we say, or the orchard hears it for them. But silence did not quench suspicion. On the 4th week of Hale's disappearance, 2 young men were dared into the orchard after dusk, carrying lanterns. Only one returned. His story was halting, his eyes glassy. The trees, he stammered. The trees. They closed in. And I saw. He broke off, clutching his throat. His friend was never seen again. The town called it foolishness. But the orchard path remained empty after that. Eleanor, too, began to sense the orchard's hunger. Once, walking alone at twilight, she heard her name called not by voice but by the rustle of leaves. The trees bent as she passed, their branches lowering as though to crown her. The air smelled faintly of roses and iron. At the orchard's heart, she found something that made her stomach twist. A veil, snagged on a branch, its lace torn but its whiteness unblemished by dirt or rain. She lifted it, trembling. Behind her, footsteps crunched the leaves. "Nathaniel," she whispered. But when she turned, no one was there. Only the sound of breath. Close, too close, though she stood alone. Back at the Morton house, Nathaniel grew more fevered in his writings. Eleanor caught him once, hunched over his desk, murmuring as his quill scratched. She leaned close enough to hear his words. Not brother, not sister, but halves of the same whole. What is forbidden by men is sanctified by blood. When he saw her, he did not stop writing. Instead, he dipped the quill again, his voice calm. "You should be glad," he said. "The reverend has given his blessing." Eleanor froze. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel lifted his eyes, black with certainty. "I heard him. In the orchard." He spoke the words, though his lips were bound. He said yes. Her pulse faltered. She remembered the dreams. Hale's sewn mouth. The scripture whispered from nowhere. The scrap of paper left in his study. Yes. That night Eleanor locked her door, but sleep betrayed her again. She dreamt of Hale standing in the orchard. His eyes stitched shut now as well, his Bible clutched against his chest. Nathaniel stood beside him, waiting, his hand extended. When Eleanor refused to step forward, Hale's sewn mouth opened wider than flesh should allow, spilling not words but soil and ash. She woke screaming, but her scream was answered. From the hallway came another voice, shrill and echoing as though mocking her. It was Reverend Hale's voice, and it was coming from inside the house. The investigator Ashcroft had endured whispers, endured vanished children and a silent pulpit, but it could not endure lawlessness. On the first frost of November, a magistrate was summoned from Boston, a man named Silas Crane. Crane arrived on horseback, his coat stiff with the city's polish, his hat angled against the wind. He was not of Ashcroft, and the townsfolk eyed him as though he carried a contagion. Yet behind their suspicion was a hunger. They needed someone else to name the evil they feared, someone who could give shape to the absence that loomed over them. Crane was no priest. He was a man of reason, his eyes sharp, his notebook sharper. He believed in evidence, in testimony, in the weight of things that could be touched and measured. What he found in Ashcroft, however, unsettled even him. The reverend was gone. The orchard whispered with rumors, and everywhere he turned the name of Morton lingered like smoke. His first visit was to the Morton estate. Nathaniel greeted him at the door with a calm so deliberate it verged on arrogance. "Mr. Crane," Nathaniel said, bowing slightly. "I was told you were expected. Come in." "You'll find no specters here," Crane entered. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and ink. He noted the absence of servants, the dust that lay too neatly on the banisters as though someone had placed it there intentionally. Eleanor appeared in the hall, pale as a candle flame. She did not speak. Her eyes flicked to Crane's face and then away, as though she already knew what he sought. "I come regarding Reverend Hale," Crane said. "His absence has unsettled your town." Nathaniel folded his hands. Reverend Hale was a good man, but men grow weary. Perhaps he chose to leave. Crane studied him. "And left his Bible behind?" Nathaniel's smile did not falter. Perhaps the word had become too heavy. Eleanor flinched. Crane noticed. That night, Crane took a room above the tavern. The landlord, eager for gossip, whispered as he poured ale. "It's the Mortons, sir. Always them. I've seen the boy in the orchard at hours no Christian should be abroad. I've heard the girl call out in her sleep as though answering a vow." Crane asked questions, careful, patient. The accounts varied, but one truth pressed through them all. Nathaniel and Eleanor were too close, their bond too strange, and Hale had been last seen beneath their roof. Evidence, Crane told himself. He needed evidence. The orchard gave him his first clue. Guided by lantern, he walked its rows, noting the unnatural bend of the trees. Their branches formed arches, almost like a chapel. their bark scarred with lines that looked uncomfortably like script. His boot struck something half buried in the soil. He knelt and unearthed it. A button. Plain but stamped with a cross. The button from a minister's coat. Nearby, the earth seemed freshly turned. He dug with his hands until he struck wood. Not a coffin, but a box no larger than a Bible. Inside was a piece of cloth, white as a wedding veil, though the edges were stained with something dark. Crane shut the box quickly, his lantern trembling. When he lifted his head, Eleanor was standing between the trees. She wore no cloak, no shoes though. The frost glittered on the ground. Her eyes reflected the lantern's light like a cat's. "You should not dig," she whispered. "Why not?" Crane asked. "Because the orchard remembers, and it does not forgive." Then she turned and vanished into the rose, silent as breath. The next day, Crane confronted Nathaniel with the button. "Reverend Hale was here," Crane said. Nathaniel examined it as though it were a curiosity, nothing more. Perhaps ministers often call on their flock and leave pieces of themselves behind. Nathaniel's eyes gleamed. Faith demands sacrifice. Crane pressed him harder, but Nathaniel's calm was unbreakable. Instead, it was Eleanor who faltered. She sat in the corner, her hands clenched white, her lips parting as though she wished to speak but feared the words themselves. When Nathaniel excused himself to fetch tea, Crane leaned close. "Miss Morton," he said softly, "if you know what befell Reverend Hale, you must tell me. Before the town decides for itself." Eleanor's eyes filled. She opened her mouth, but Nathaniel's footsteps returned. Her words died in her throat. Crane realized then that fear, not ignorance, bound her tongue. That night, Crane recorded his impressions. The brother conceals, the sister trembles. The orchard is no mere ground but a stage. I suspect Hale's fate lies beneath it, though I lack the authority to exhume. What disturbs me most, the girl's manner. She is not merely complicit. She is haunted. Haunted by what, I cannot yet say. He closed his book. The tavern creaked, and then faint but clear he heard a voice beneath his window. "Say yes." He rushed to the glass. Below in the frost, Eleanor stood in her nightdress, her face turned upward, her lips moving soundlessly. When he shouted her name, she vanished. By the week's end, Crane prepared to call a hearing. But before he could, a new piece of evidence emerged. The church sexton, while cleaning Hale's chambers again, discovered something tucked inside a hymnal. A note written in Eleanor's hand: "Do not fear. The vows are not yet spoken, but they will be. I cannot resist him. The orchard knows. When the reverend stands witness, all will be finished." Signed simply, E. The town erupted. Women crossed themselves. Men muttered of curses. And Crane, holding the note, felt dread coil in his stomach, for the note was dated 3 days after Hale had vanished. That night, Crane dreamed for the first time since coming to Ashcroft. He dreamt of the orchard, of Hale's stitched eyes, of Nathaniel's hand extended. But worst of all, he dreamt of Eleanor. Standing before him, veil lowered, her voice steady. "Yes," she said. And when he woke, his hands were dirty with soil. The hearing, the town of Ashcroft, desperate for order, gathered in the chapel to hear Magistrate Crane's findings. Snow hissed against the windows, the pews groaning under the weight of bodies pressed close. There was no sermon, no hymns, only silence broken by the sound of boots stamping the cold from their soles. Eleanor sat near the front, her veil lowered, Nathaniel beside her. He did not fidget, did not even breathe visibly, but sat as still as carved stone. Crane stood at the pulpit, his notebook in hand, his voice steady but grim. "Reverend Hale is missing," he began. "We have his coat, his Bible, and testimony that he was last seen entering the Morton estate. We have the orchard whose soil has been disturbed. And we have this." He held aloft the note. Gasps rippled through the room. Eleanor's shoulders flinched, though she did not lift her head. "A confession," Crane said. Written in the hand of Eleanor Morton, suggesting her knowledge of, if not her consent to vows spoken with her brother, witnessed by Reverend Hale. The words hung like smoke. Mothers shielded their children's ears. A man spat onto the floor. Nathaniel's lips curved into the faintest smile. Eleanor wanted to scream. She wanted to protest that she had written no such thing, that she would sooner burn than set quill to such blasphemy. Yet in her heart, she remembered nights she could not account for. Blank hours between dusk and dawn, soil beneath her fingernails at morning, A quill on her desk, ink still wet. Though she did not recall writing, had she written it in sleep? Or had Nathaniel written it for her hand? The thought made her bones tremble. When Crane read the note aloud, Eleanor swore she could hear her own voice echo the words, though her lips never moved. Do not fear. The vows are not yet spoken. Her veil shook with her breath. The hearing unraveled quickly. Some demanded Eleanor be confined, others that Nathaniel face the gallows. But the town was split by fear. If the Mortons were guilty, then the orchard itself might be cursed, and curses, once named, did not die easily. Nathaniel rose when permitted to speak. His voice carried not with volume but with gravity. Your reverend is not gone, he said. He is transformed. What he witnessed cannot be undone, nor should it. You call it forbidden. I call it truth. You worship words written on paper. We worship what bleeds beneath those words. Blood speaks more purely than ink. Gasps, cries a woman fainting. Crane slammed his palm to the pulpit. Enough. You mock this court with riddles. But Nathaniel's eyes glowed with something Crane had not seen before. Not madness, not deceit, but conviction so profound it bent reality around it. And Eleanor felt the orchard stir inside her chest. That night, Crane wrestled with doubt. He read the note again by candlelight. The handwriting was Eleanor's, identical in slant and stroke. Yet something about the ink unsettled him. It shimmered faintly as though damp, though the paper was dry. When he touched it, the tips of his fingers came away dark, as though he had dipped them in soil. He washed his hands, but the stain lingered. He shut the note, locked it in his case, and whispered aloud to himself, "It is impossible." And yet, from the corner of the room came a whisper soft as breath, "Say yes." Crane spun. No one was there. Only the window rimmed with frost where his own reflection stared back, but with its lips parted. Meanwhile, Eleanor's dreams no longer confined themselves to sleep. She walked the orchard at dawn and found petals strewn across the ground, white as a bridal path, though the trees had long since withered. The path led her to a clearing where chairs were arranged, chairs she swore had not been there before. 12 of them empty, facing a stump as though awaiting a ceremony. On the stump lay a Bible, Reverend Hale's Bible. When she opened it, the pages were blank, save for one line written across the center in Hale's hand. I bear witness. She fled, but the petals clung to her hem, white and damp. Even when she returned to the house, the petals remained, though Nathaniel swore he saw nothing. Eleanor, he said gently, brushing at her skirts. The vows will free you. Stop resisting, her throat closed. Free me or bind me? His smile widened. Is there a difference? Days blurred. Crane pressed townsfolk for testimony but found only contradictions. Some swore they heard Eleanor walking in the orchard at night, her veil trailing in the frost. Others claimed Hale had been seen in the same orchard, though his eyes were closed, his steps unsteady, his voice reciting scripture in tones not human. At last, Crane resolved to search the Morton estate himself. He came at night, lantern in hand, and entered through the orchard. The trees closed behind him like ribs. The air was heavy with rose and rot. At the house's edge, he saw a light in an upstairs window. A shadow passed across it, Eleanor's form, unmistakable. Then another shadow beside hers, identical in height and shape, 2 Eleanors. He blinked, and one was gone. Inside, he found Eleanor asleep in her bed, her hands folded as though in prayer. On her finger gleamed a ring, gold plain, tight on the skin. When Crane reached to touch it, her eyes flew open. Do not take it, she hissed, her voice low, strange. It was given. By whom? Crane demanded, her lips quivered. By me, to him, and by him, to me. The words chilled him more than any superstition. He backed away, lantern trembling, and then he saw it. A second imprint on the bed beside her, as though another had lain there. The next morning, the town awoke to find the chapel doors nailed shut from the inside. When at last they broke them open, they found the pews filled with petals, white, damp, fresh, and on the pulpit lay Reverend Hale's spectacles, their lenses cracked. Beneath them was a single scrap of parchment, written in Hale's hand. The vows have begun. The wedding bell. The first snow came heavy to Ashcroft, pressing roofs low, bending orchard boughs like penitent backs. Yet under the weight of winter, the whispers only grew louder. The chapel's doors were sealed again, this time with chains the deacon swore he had not placed. Petals continued to appear where no blossoms grew, at thresholds, on windowsills, even inside closed cupboards, and still, the Mortons walked among them. Nathaniel with his steady stride, his black coat unmarked by snow. Eleanor with her veil always lowered, her steps faltering as though she walked in two worlds at once. Some swore they saw her lips move when no sound came, as though answering vows spoken only to her. At last, the town demanded action. On the night of December's first Sabbath, men gathered with lanterns and hammers, women clutching rosaries and children hidden behind locked doors. They marched to the Morton estate, the snow crunching beneath their boots, their breaths sharp with fear. At their head was Magistrate Crane, though even his confidence was cracked. "We will search the house," he declared. "We will search the orchard, and we will find the reverend, alive or dead." Nathaniel met them at the door, unarmed, unafraid. "You will find him," he said, "but not as you remember. Witness if you dare. The vows cannot be undone." The men surged forward. The house swallowed them, and Eleanor, standing at the stair, felt her knees tremble. She wanted to cry out, to beg them to leave, not for Nathaniel's sake nor for hers, but because she knew the house itself would not let them go. They searched the lower rooms first. Crane opened cupboards, trunks, even the hearth, but found only dust and ink-stained pages. The letters scattered across Nathaniel's desk had multiplied, hundreds now, all bearing Eleanor's name. Some written in Nathaniel's hand, some in Eleanor's, some in a hand neither recognized. Each carried the same refrain: "Say yes." In the orchard, men struck the frozen ground with spades. The earth gave reluctantly, but soon they uncovered more boxes like the first. Inside were veils, rings, scraps of cloth. One contained nothing but hair, pale as Eleanor's, tied with ribbon. Another contained a jawbone. The men recoiled, some crossing themselves, some retching into the snow. But the earth did not still. It heaved as though something beneath pressed upward. The trees groaned, branches swaying though no wind blew. From the orchard's heart came the toll of a bell, yet there was no bell. Eleanor heard it too, from inside the house. It struck through her bones, each toll sinking deeper like nails driven into wood. Nathaniel took her hand. "It is time," he whispered. She shook her head. "I never agreed." He smiled, serene. "You agreed each night you dreamed. You agreed each morning you woke with the ring still upon you. Consent is not spoken, Eleanor, it is lived." Her stomach twisted. She pulled her hand free, but the ring on her finger burned as though reminding her. Crane, meanwhile, descended the cellar steps with two men. The air was thick, sweet with rot. His lantern flickered against the stone. At the far wall, boards had been torn away, revealing a hollow where soil pressed through. And in that soil, half buried, was Reverend Hale. His eyes were stitched shut, his lips as well, yet his chest rose and fell faintly, impossibly. His hands clutched a Bible, its cover fused to his flesh. The men gasped, one crossing himself, the other fleeing upward in terror. Crane approached, bile rising in his throat. "My God," he whispered. "You live!" Hale's head turned toward him, though his eyes were sealed. His voice came not from his mouth, but from the air itself, vibrating the lantern flame. "Bear witness." The lantern shattered. The cellar went black. Upstairs, the townsfolk gathered, shouting, crossing, clutching one another. Eleanor swayed at the stair, veil trembling. Nathaniel raised his arms as though conducting a service. "You see?" he cried. "He lives. He bears witness still. The vows are holy." The bell tolled again, louder, closer. This time the townsfolk heard it too. They clutched their ears, some falling to their knees. Snow sifted through the rafters, though the roof was whole. And then, one by one, the candles extinguished themselves. In the dark, Eleanor felt hands, not Nathaniel's, not the townsfolk's, lifting her veil. She screamed. But when the light returned, she was dressed in white. The chapel had come to them. Or perhaps they had been carried to it. Eleanor stood in the orchard clearing. Snow melted away. Chairs filled with townsfolk frozen in place, their eyes wide but their bodies unmoving. At the stump stood Reverend Hale, blind and bound, yet upright. His Bible clutched. Nathaniel stood beside her, his hand warm against hers. "Say yes," he whispered. The bell tolled once more, and the orchard bent low, as though it too awaited her answer. The vows the orchard had become a chapel. Snow melted where none should melt, frost drawn back as though commanded. The trees bent overhead, their branches forming an arch as solemn as any cathedral. Beneath it, Eleanor stood in white, her veil trembling though no wind stirred. The townsfolk filled the chairs, their eyes wide, their bodies rigid. They were not guests but prisoners, their throats locked, their hands bound to their laps by invisible bonds. Children wept soundlessly. Men stared as though their souls had been nailed in place. At the stump stood Reverend Hale. His eyes and lips were still sewn shut, but his voice filled the clearing, booming like the toll of a hidden bell. "Do you, Nathaniel Morton, take this woman?" The words dragged through the orchard like iron chains. "To be your lawfully wedded wife, forsaking all others." Eleanor's heart thrashed against her ribs. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet would not move. Nathaniel's hand was warm in hers, steady, certain. "So long as you both shall live." "Yes," Nathaniel said. His voice was thunder. His smile glowed. The orchard groaned, its branches shuddering with approval. Then Hale's blind gaze turned to Eleanor. "And do you, Eleanor Morton, take this man? Your brother." The words caught, stuttered, warped. Hale's sewn mouth stretched wider than lips should allow. The word brother echoed again and again, each repetition darker, lower, until the trees themselves seemed to whisper it. "To be your husband, to cleave unto him, to seal with vow and blood." The town's eyes bored into her, wide, accusing, pleading. Crane among them, his face pale, his jaw straining against the silence that bound him. "Eleanor," Nathaniel whispered. "Say it. Say yes." The ring burned against her finger. The veil weighed like stone. Her throat opened, but in that instant, something shifted. Hale's voice cracked. The bell tone faltered. And beneath the question, Eleanor heard another voice. Older, deeper. A voice not of man, nor of Nathaniel, nor of Hale. A voice of soil, of root, of orchard. It whispered, "You are not his bride. You are mine." Eleanor's knees buckled. The world lurched. She saw it then. Visions unraveling like torn veils. Nathaniel at his desk, scribbling not letters but incantations, thinking himself the author when the orchard guided his hand. Hale drawn into the soil, made vessel not witness. The town bound to chairs not by Nathaniel but by the land they had farmed, cursed by the roots they had ignored. Nathaniel was never the groom. He was the offering. The orchard had dressed him in certainty to lure her here. The true groom was older, hungrier, the land itself. Eleanor gasped. Nathaniel's hand clutched hers tighter. "Say yes," he demanded, his voice trembling now, as though he feared she had seen too much. Hale's sewn lips parted wider, soil spilling from them like breath. The orchard whispered again, "Say yes and be bound. Say no and all will burn." Eleanor looked to the frozen faces of the town, to Crane straining against invisible cords, to the sky above where snow had ceased to fall, and at last she spoke. "Yes." The orchard roared. The trees bowed low, branches rattling like applause. The earth split beneath them, roots thrashing like serpents. Nathaniel exhaled in triumph, but then his hand was torn from hers. The roots seized him, dragging him backward, wrapping his limbs. His eyes widened in terror. "No," he screamed. "Not me. She said yes. She said yes to me." But the orchard did not heed him. His body was drawn into the soil, swallowed whole, his voice strangled into silence. Eleanor staggered, veil torn, her ring glowing hot. The orchard whispered once more, filling her skull. "He was never the groom. You are the bride. The vow is sealed." And around her the townsfolk blinked awake. Their silence broke into screams. Crane tore himself free, rushing forward. He seized Eleanor by the arm, trying to drag her from the clearing. "Run! Run before it takes you too." But when he looked into her eyes, he faltered. For Eleanor was smiling. It was not madness. It was not joy. It was recognition. The orchard had not trapped her. It had chosen her. And deep down, she had always known. "Bear witness," she whispered in Hale's borrowed voice. And Crane understood. The vows were not meant to unite Eleanor and Nathaniel. They were meant to unite Eleanor and Ashcroft itself. Bride and town. Blood and soil. The snow fell again, covering the orchard in white. By dawn, the clearing was empty. No chairs, no stump, no veil. The townsfolk remembered little save for fragments of a dream they dared not repeat. Reverend Hale's body was never found. Nathaniel Morton's name was never spoken again, but Eleanor remained. She walked through Ashcroft's streets with her veil lowered, her ring glinting in the pale sun. And wherever she passed, the orchard branches bent lower. Some said the land grew richer that year, the harvest more abundant. Others whispered that the soil was fed with more than rain. Children dared one another to run between the rows at dusk, but none lingered long. For if you listened closely, beneath the rustle of branches, you could hear a voice, soft as breath, asking a single question. Will you say yes? Final twist and psychological aftertaste. The crime was never solved. The reverend was never found. The law could not name the horror because the horror was not man-made. Ashcroft endured, but changed. The town itself had taken vows, bound through Eleanor, its unwilling bride. And though the orchard no longer groaned, no longer tolled its phantom bell, every wedding in Ashcroft thereafter ended in silence, as though the land itself was listening, waiting, whispering, for the next yes.